Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was January 6th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We are looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. The date of January 6th makes me think about transitions of power and how in the midst of a transition of power, malefactors and political opponents can take advantage of this moment of vulnerability for a political system. The time of a transition of power is one that is a moment of opportunity to challenge the system, because in that transition moment, the system is not really running on its own momentum as much because there's a change taking place. In an interesting coincidence, the transition of power in 1387 in the Crown of Aragon took place in the span of January 5th to January 6th of that year, 639 years ago. January 5th is the day that King Per the Ceremonious died. I dug into this a bit and tried to find some kind of actual certification of his death on January 5th. I could only find a quote from one of the registers of the Archive of the Crown of Aragon in a secondary source, one that I've mentioned on the podcast before. It's written by Rafael Tassis y Marca. And he did not cite his sources. He has no footnotes in his book. This is a work published in 1959. I think maybe it was originally printed in 1957, but the edition I'm working with is from 1959. Rafael Tassis y Marca quotes a Latin sentence, long Latin sentence, from January 5th. Part of the sentence says, Rex Petrus naturae salvens debitum animam suam altissimo redditit creatori. And that, in effect, says that his spirit returned to the Creator, and that's confirming that Per died. And this inscription is dated on the 5th of January, 1387. Violant definitely finds out about this by January 6th, because when we look at Violant's registers of letters in Registro 1819, we see that letters dated January 6th refer to her as the Queen. The document we're looking at today is one of those, and it appears on a page in the register that's a really fun page, because on the recto side of this folio, the letters are from December 22nd, December 24th, and January 3rd, and they all have La Duquesa as the sender, and then you turn the page and you see that the sender is now La Reina. And so it's a pretty cool thing to see in the documentation, this transition that takes place. The document that we're looking at today is a letter from Violant to Joan. And these are the letters that I think are the ones that are going to be of the most worthwhile focus for me as I'm trying to understand the way that the two of them related to each other. Before we get to that one, though, I just want to point out that, doing a little bit of a sort of twofer situation here, the letter that appears at the top of the page is one that Violant is writing to Marti, and she's starting it out by saying, hey, you're absent, you're not here right now, and so we're figuring some stuff out, specifically when we're going to bury the body of the dead king. And Violant says, it's happening next Tuesday, implication being you should really make it back to Barcelona by then. So Violant knows that Pere has died. She is starting the arrangements for putting him in the ground. That's the letter that's at the top of the page. Now, the letter that we're going to put our focus onto for today's episode is the one that's in the middle of the page. And it starts out, Molt excellent principe e poderos signor marit e signor meo molt car. So this is a whole string of honorifics that Violant is providing to Joan, most excellent prince and powerful lord husband and lord most dear to me. That's how she's starting it out. And then she goes on to provide some information about... it's kind of hard to figure out what's going on here, because she's saying that she's got a letter from a Gaston Montcada about the Count of Empurias. This gets into some background information about what happened in the year before. The Count of Empurias had risen up in rebellion against Pere, and Joan had been kind of empathetic. Like, he hadn't, sent forces to help the Count of Empurias, but he wasn't really condemning it either. And that's another thing that got Pere very angry at Joan in those last months of his life. And in fact, here's a little cool additional piece of information about the family estrangement and rancor. Pere had started to write some documentation ordering that if Joan died, that forces would be sent to get Joan and Violant's son and to kidnap him, basically to take him away, so that Violant would not be able to basically raise him, or I guess maybe the fear would be use Joan's son to make a claim for the throne at some future moment. I think Pere knows that he's kind of getting to the end of his life, but basically this maneuver is one that really is an infuriating one to Joan and Violant, obviously. So that is just another kind of level of family rancor that gets set off by how Joan is not really coming out against the Count of Empurias in this moment of a rebellion. And it's not like the Count of Empurias has raised a big army and is going to go capture Barcelona. It's just that the Count of Empurias, after some kind of dispute with Pere, is just saying, I'm done. I'm just not going to be a part of the Crown of Aragon anymore. And then things sort of settled down. And I think the concern at this moment during the transition of power is that the Count of Empurias might take advantage of this moment and do some kind of more aggressive official splitting off or defiance against the crown because he sees an opportunity, a vulnerability in this moment of transition of power. So I think that Violant is on this, and she's had an emissary reach out to the Count of Empúries about just sticking with Joan and just, there's a way to work out our differences here. Don't split away. Wait to see what Joan as king is going to do, and you might be happy to stay and we can settle our differences. That's my guess about what's going on, but I have to admit that there's certainly writing about this in the secondary literature that I have not really dug into, and so I could be wrong about this, but I think the general idea is that Violant is taking action to look at the places where the new regime might be vulnerable and looking to take action to increase and bolster the authority of this new monarchy. And she's informing Joan about this. But let's talk about how Violant is saying that she's taking care of business here. The scholar Claire Poncy, who's writing now about Joan and Violant in particular, she has looked at these letters, and Claire Poncy is really like the number one authority on Violant de Bar today. Claire Poncy did a close reading of this very letter, and that's why I decided to choose it, because it appears in a 2008 journal article, and on page 97 of that article, Claire Poncy does a close reading of this letter and pulls out a sentence in particular. Here it is, translated into English, and this is Violant, okay, to Joan. Quote, "Do not finalize anything until we, you, and your brother are together." Unquote. So Claire Poncy has spent a ton of time reading Violant's letters from the time she was a duchess, and then also during the time of her queenship and after, during widowhood. And Claire Poncy is saying Violant's assumption of queenly authority is noticeable in this sentence, and especially the kind of queenly authority that she is going to be engaging in here. That is to say, she's not shy about issuing directives to her husband, the king. And this is a really interesting argument that Claire Poncy makes. I am inclined to follow right along with it because she has spent so much time looking at these letters, and she would definitely be the one to be able to conduct a very informed, close reading. So here we are, really getting at the focus of what I'm trying to understand more about in the way that Joan and Violant related to each other and the kind of project that they set out to create as they envisioned the way that they were going to be king and queen. Violant is clearly comfortable with taking charge and directing action, and she needs to in this moment, apparently, because Joan is not in Barcelona, because Joan is possibly sick and possibly deathly ill, as a matter of fact. We don't have good information about what condition Joan was in day to day. I spent some time trying to track down details about the illness that he's suffering in this period of time in January of 1387. The scholar Josep Roca is the one who finds a letter from April 30th, and Roca reads this letter. It's one that Violant is writing that describes Joan's illness. And he looks at that letter from April 30th, and he says that it is about what took place in January. I have looked at the register and I've looked at that page, and to be honest, I'm having a little bit of a problem understanding how Roca came to that conclusion. But Roca spent a lot of time reading these documents, and so I'm inclined to trust him, but I really want to know how he figured out that what she was writing about on April 30th had to do with Joan's condition in January, and wasn't like a later illness that took place in April, right around the time she's writing. Because it's not clear to me, but I'll figure it out. I'll puzzle that out. I've got until April 30th to figure that one out. But according to Roca, this letter from April 30th describes what was taking place in January, and at some point in January, Joan became so ill that he was given last rites, that he couldn't speak, that he was seemingly unconscious, and it looked like he was going to die even before he could make it to Barcelona to start his reign as king. So that's what is likely happening in these moments. We just don't know, like, day to day what Violant is aware of. She's writing to Joan, so presumably she thinks that Joan can read her letter, but who is informing her about Joan's condition at this time? How is she finding out information about that? It's one of the major questions that I have as I'm looking at these letters. And of course, there's all the questions about the content of the letter itself, and how vulnerable is this new regime right as it's beginning on the first day of their reign, which is January 6th, 1387. I'm also kind of curious about some of the details, like where is Violant living at this time? Like, how has her household started to merge or replace, like, the staff of the royal palace? Or is Violant actually living in some other kind of residence? And I'm also just really wanting to know, how did Violant feel about the start of her reign at this point? Is she feeling vulnerable, or is she feeling really confident? I mean, my guess is that there's kind of a mixture of both, because there's no immediate threat. It seems like everyone agrees it makes sense for Joan to be inheriting the throne. No one knows how sick he is. So it seems like there's no contender to threaten the succession here. But I think Violant is also very aware that it's not going according to plan, because she's the one that's there in Barcelona and Joan is not. All right, that does it for today's episode. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Companiona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I have done my job. Remember, The Historian's Notebook has a motto, and that motto is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website, jonathanseyfried.net, to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, including a bibliographic reference to that article by Claire Ponsic. It is in French, by the way, so you'll have to, if you want to read that one, you got to brush up on your French. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.